Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/kyhistorypod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms. Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. Welcome back to the Kentucky History Podcast. I'm your host, Jameson Cable, and I'm back again here with David Kirkpatrick, and we're going to talk about the War of 1812. More importantly, the Kentucky's involvement in the War of 1812 and all those militiamen and so forth. David, how you doing?
Doing well. You?
I'm doing good. I know, we're recording this. It's time's a little different. It's Christmas time, actually. We recorded this after Christmas.
That's right.
So hopefully everybody had a good holiday. You'll probably be listening to this in April. So happy
That's
Easter.
Perfect. Yeah, better weather and everything too. So I'll take it.
Yeah. So let's get into it a little bit here, or maybe a little bit of a recap. The War of 1812, and we mention this probably every time, the kind of forgotten war,
right?
And even more importantly, the forgotten part about that war, which was in the West, which involved Kentucky greatly. We talked about the involvement of Kentucky, the recruitment of Kentucky soldiers, how important it was, how much pride they took into it. And we talked about the River Raisin massacre, the Battle of Fort Meigs,
right,
all involving Kentuckians. But you've written a book about this. You're the expert. We're moving a little forward, onward into the war. What we got next?
Well, if I had to boil the War of 1812 in the West down to a Cliff Notes version, basically what you just said, there are three phases for the West. There's the losing phase, where we take a beating as a nation pretty early on. Then there is stopping that momentum, regaining your ground. And then there's a phase of victories and a string of wins for the U.S. And again, in the West, that primarily means Kentucky troops. So that first phase, the loss of Detroit, surrenders Michigan, entire territory. We mentioned the River Raisin, the massacre there. That's a major defeat for Kentucky troops. And then we move into, stopping that British momentum, which you mentioned Fort Meigs, and also there's a small battle called Fort Stephenson. And then now this is the chance for those folks here in the West to start moving forward. They've stopped and moved southward. And Governor Shelby has struggled with this from the very beginning. He is an old warrior. He'd been in the Revolution. He had seen a lot of fighting between Native Americans and settlers. And he was extremely concerned with how Washington was handling the war here. And he complained. He wrote letters before the war really even got started. He's complaining to the White House, and they kind of, pat him on the head and say, "We've got this thing figured out. Don't worry about it." And he does not take this well. Shelby's in his 60s. He's seen a lot. And so by the time this happens, there's been so much lost in terms of treasure and in citizens that have been killed. And finally, Shelby is given the option to take the field himself by Harrison, William Henry Harrison. And he seizes that. And I wonder sometimes how much that surprised people, because, again, you're in your 60s. And, that's in the modern era where we've got, good shoes and good equipment and nutritious meals, that still wouldn't be easy for someone in their 60s, much less someone living off hardtack, and homespun clothes. But he decides that he's going to raise an army. And in August, he sends out the call. And I don't want to take up a lot of time with that, but he sends a letter out to militia troops in the state that he wants dispersed everywhere. And basically, he tells them, he said, "I will meet you there in person. I will lead you in the field of battle and share with you in the dangers and the honors of the campaign." So Shelby makes it abundantly clear that these militiamen will fight if they have confidence in the person who's leading them. And he is not disappointed. About a month later, they have the troops ready to go, and they're marching northward. And they get, I guess, to the area just south of the Great Lakes in mid-September. And Shelby had promised the men, he said, "First of all, I want people who can bring horses." He said, "You can't ride. This is not the campaign for you. This is a lightning strike." He had seen how people had gotten mired down in earlier campaigns. And so he leads the troops forward, and he has one goal in mind. They are going to retake the territory that's been lost and crush the British in the West. So that's the setup for the battle.
Well, that is quite moving. I mean, I can only imagine being a Kentuckian at the time and getting a letter from your governor saying, "Hey, I'm gonna meet you there. I'm gonna be there with you, and let's move forward." I mean, that's pretty impressive.
Oh, yeah.
You gotta say. And I mean, we were just previously talking on before we started about my dad being about 61, 62,
Right.
and like understanding that he doesn't need to go skiing and that could get himself hurt. So the same thing though. Here's Shelby is in his 60s saying, "You know what? I'm still going to go and battle
Yeah.
and lead them in." That's quite impressive. I'm going to throw a little picture up here of Isaac Shelby, the first and the fifth governor of Kentucky. So pretty impressive. The march. How long was the march up to the?
Let's see. He issues the request for troops on July 31st, or at the start of August. They rendezvous to march northward on the 31st of August, and they are at the edge of Lake Erie on September 20th or so. So what the plan is to march directly northward and then have Oliver Hazard Perry's ships ferry them across into Canada. So the other option is to march around Lake Erie to the west and try to cross at Detroit, cross the river at Detroit. And they decide not to do that. They want to have an amphibious landing, which sounds more difficult, but at the same time, it might catch the enemy off guard.
Yeah. Now, when you say an amphibious landing, that means going from water to land, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. There was a series of islands in Lake Erie, and the plan was, even with Oliver Hazard Perry's ships, they couldn't ferry everybody at once. So basically what they're doing is they're ferrying hundreds of men to an island, and they're leapfrogging from island to island. And to read some of the letters that are written from there, there's not a lot of shelter. There's no trees. You're out here on Lake Erie. It's September, so you can imagine, Canadian weather in September. It's not the best place to be. A lot of people got sick, but they're making their way northward. And something you and I had talked about before, the reason they're even able to execute this plan is that the U.S. has won a major victory over the British on Lake Erie. And they also called the Battle of Put-in Bay, which is where they sailed from. And, even there, Shelby and his troops haven't got there yet, but there are some Kentuckians involved in that battle because Oliver Hazard Perry realized he needed men on deck who could keep the British busy, who could fire at them. So he makes a request to Harrison, who is already in the area, who already has a number of militia troops under his command, including Kentuckians. And so he loans about 100 men from the 28th U.S. Infantry and a number from the Kentucky militia. And their job is to stay on board, maybe find a place in the rigging, and just be sharpshooters at the British who are running backwards and forwards on the ship, who are trying to aim cannons, who are giving navigational orders. And these guys are amazed. Many of them probably hadn't seen anything larger than the Ohio River, and now they're being put on these vessels. And but it works well. There's a major victory, and of course, you talk about the war being forgotten. In a lot of ways, it's half remembered because I think most Americans remember the phrase, we have met the enemy and they are ours. That's this battle. So Lake Erie has been swept, and the British realize they're in deep trouble because now they can't cut American supply lines. So that's kind of how things are going as they're marching northward.
Yeah, that is one of the coolest phrases or quotes, I believe, probably in American history. I mean, there's a lot of them out there.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, but that's a pretty good one.
Oh,
And well, and I think I mentioned this last time. I may have. Oliver Hazard Perry, Perry County in Kentucky, and Hazard,
right.
both named
And
after him.
Perryville.
There you go. So pretty cool connection there to Kentucky. But the whole ship battles, and that's the thing. Like I've personally never seen the Great Lakes, but they're massive. I mean, they're huge.
Oh, yeah.
And you don't
Yeah.
think like about a naval battle being fought on a lake. I mean, Lake Cumberland is the biggest lake, closest to me,
Right.
but it's still not as big as the Great Lakes. I mean, these suckers are huge, and I mean
Oh,
they have
yeah.
waves and everything.
Yeah. 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 We made the trip up for a War of 1812 thing. We went up to see the River Raisin. And, okay, it's going to be big. You know that in your head. But then you see it, or at least for me. And
Yeah.
I was not prepared. It's massive. And it is very ocean-like because you can't see anything but water.
Yeah, yeah, and I've seen like pictures of like Chicago and some of the other cities that are right there, and like they have beaches that are close, and you're like, well, what? But
Yeah.
again, these are huge lakes. I mean, these big ships can get through there. So I mean,
Right.
pretty impressive, pretty interesting, especially back 100 and 220 years ago or so, 210 years ago, something like that.
Close to that.
Um,
Yep.
yeah, um, but yeah, so they get gather up. You talked about the Kentucky men getting on the ships and stuff, or just being amazed by the size of the lake. Um, how long? Right off the top of your head, sorry for the spot on question, but how
It's
long
okay.
was the battle, the naval battle?
Ooh, that's a good question. It was not a terribly long one, as I recall. So I may have to punt on that one because I don't remember exactly. But I know that it was clear to both sides. It was kind of a make or break kind of deal.
Yeah,
And so I know everyone. Harrison was waiting, concerned for word, and I'm sure with the British. So yeah, it didn't take terribly long, but was pretty decisive and had pretty long ranging effects.
yeah, and I'm gonna throw up just a reminder. There's a William Henry Harrison.
Yeah.
So gotta throw a few pictures up there from time to time to
Oh yeah.
go on. So the battle lasts. I guess you could say the U.S. wins
Mhm.
I mean, it's a pretty solid victory, I believe. Correct?
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty
Yeah.
decisive. Yeah.
And then we go to the ground, I guess, campaign.
Right.
And now Shelby has led these men. Uh, the time frame from Fort Meigs to the Battle of the Thames, is that about a year difference?
No, not even that long. Fort Meigs is May of 1813, and the battle's going to end up being October of 1813. So we're just a
Okay,
few months
so
away. Yeah.
yeah, it's about. We're trying to do all this math off the top of our heads,
Yeah.
like
No,
six
that was
months or something.
not my strong suit. But yeah, just
Yeah.
2 months. And of course, the River Raisins in January of the same year. So all
Yeah.
this is happening, together. Um,
Which is why Shelby kind of rallies people up, says, "Hey, we got to get this done."
yep.
Basically saying Washington is screwing this up. Let's get this together. Or
Some things never change. That's
that's true. Oh, excuse me. And then, of course, spoiler: they burned Washington to the ground. But
yep.
uh,
Yep.
The Battle of the Thames. Oh, this is a big. I mean, just talking about Kentucky history and especially early Kentucky history. This gets brought up a bunch, and I'm bringing it up in this manner. Is so many people went up there to fight, like William
Yeah,
Whitley and all these these old hats, I guess if you want to say it that way.
yeah,
You got
yeah.
Isaac Shelby calling everybody up, saying, "Hey, I'm meeting you. We're riding. Let's go take care of business." And all these kind of older people. I mean, like William Whitley,
Mhm.
he would have been in his 60s at least, I believe. So,
Yeah,
um, if not a little older. But then other people, a whole bunch of people, I guess, kind of answered that call, and I guess the Kentucky Pride took over.
right.
But this was a big battle. This was kind of the one. Tecumseh was there. Like you said, a make or break kind of battle um, when it came down to it.
Yeah. And, it was even more significant for the Kentuckians than just the strategic point of view, because they had adopted the rallying cry, remember the Raisin. And to make matters worse, um, as they are arriving, they get on British shore and they march to the city of Malden, which was just a few miles from Detroit, right? So Ontario kind of sticks out as a peninsula. So they're marching westward towards Detroit first, and they find the place abandoned. And the British have fallen back, they're retreating. Meanwhile, they're joined by another group of Kentuckians that are led by Richard Mentor Johnson, who later became vice president.
Hmm.
And he is
And
commanding.
he's from Kentucky too, as well.
Yep, absolutely. And he's commanding a group of mounted infantry. And they had marched up kind of around the lakes. So Shelby and the men with him and are marching, and they cross Lake Erie by boat. The cavalrymen had come around the lake, and in doing so, they have to pass through Frenchtown, the place where the battle had taken place in January. And the descriptions we get are somewhat haunting. These folks, they arrived there. It's completely different than it had been described in January. It was frozen. It was covered in snow.
Hmm.
And now it's green. Things are in bloom. Fruit trees, several soldiers said fruit trees were full and heavy laden and branches breaking because there was no one really left to pick them. The community had suffered. But the worst thing was, as they're marching northward and the city or little town comes into sight, they can see little dots of white here and there in the fields of green. As they get closer, they realize they're bones, and they find
Oh,
the skeletal remains of the Kentuckians that had fallen in the massacre. And so, as
oh,
you can understand, they're already pretty fired up, but seeing your comrades, seeing people from your communities disrespected, not just killed in a massacre, but disrespected in this way, was pretty hard on them. So they've got that in the back of their mind. So by the time these mounted infantry meet up with Shelby and the rest, they've got around 5,500 men under arms, and they're loaded for bear. I mean, they're ready to go, and they realize the British are retreating. They're trying to shorten their supply lines, and so they
mhm.
begin in pursuit. So now they've crossed into Ontario, and they're pursuing the British.
Kind of I mean, man, that would be rough. That would be very, tough to go through. Kind of revisiting those wounds, I guess. Or if
Yeah,
you want to say, pouring salt in the wounds,
right,
to see that and then kind of like, I guess, embolden them to go forward. And like you said, it was a big rallying call for Kentucky. Kind of we want to prove our worth, I guess, or prove
right.
that the other things were flukes in a way. Now, in Fort Meigs, Green Clay was involved in that. Is he in the Thames as well?
No, he's not with them at the Thames, and I can't remember if he's still stationed at Fort Meigs. He might still be in command of Fort Meigs. I think he is. I have to double check
Mhm.
that because Harrison had given him command of that. Harrison is with Shelby in the men in the field, and then they have a few other guys besides the Kentucky contingent. Not a whole lot. Most of those guys are Kentuckians, but Harrison is there. And in all technical terms, Shelby is deferring to Harrison, but really they're
Yeah.
working as a team.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're marching, and the other incentive they have is not just you're going to catch the same army that allowed the massacre to happen, but the British. He was a colonel at the time. He's now a general who kind of looked the other way and allowed the massacre to happen. Henry Proctor uh,
Mhm.
is the guy in command of the British forces. So if you can catch him, I mean,
Yeah.
they're really motivated at this point.
You
So
know, I'm looking for thinking of the term, but I guess uh, I don't want to say revenge, but like you kind of. I mean, basically, that's probably the best way to say it. You get your revenge, or you get
yeah,
your payback, however you kind of want to lay that out there. Now, what about Winchester? So, because he was, because he this guy, General Winchester. He wasn't. He was captured, right?
yeah, he was captured at the River Raisin, and he's no longer part of the command. He may have been kept. Most of the Kentuckians who were captured at the River Raisin are paroled, and that's of course where they promise never to fight again, and you sign a paper, and yeah,
Yeah. I'll never fight
yeah,
again.
I promise. Of course, as soon as you get back,
Scout's honor.
but and some of the guys actually use it as an excuse. They say, "I've pledged my honor," and they don't want to go back or they're worried about being killed.
Yeah.
But most of those guys are paroled in New York State at right where Niagara Falls is, and then they're allowed to march home. Some of them weren't. James Madison or like Gabe, excuse me, Governor Madison.
Yeah.
First
George
name
Madison. George
George
Madison.
Madison.
Yeah.
Goodness, I was mixing George Madison and Gabe Slaughter. George Madison is kept as a prisoner in Quebec, and I can't remember if Winchester is as well as an officer or not. But yeah, he's out of the picture at this point. And so this is a fresh group of folks, and of course they're led by new officers, and they're prepared, And as they're pursuing the British, they realize how quickly the British are falling back because within a few days they begin to see instances of buildings burned or a ship that's still moored but it's on fire, and they realize the British are falling back and they're taking their supplies with them. And when they finally do meet up, it's on October 5th, and there's been a lot of debate about why the British met them when they did and where they did. Because, it's not glamorous to be on a retreat, but really it was the smart thing to do. And the British get credit for that because the further you fall back, the more you shorten your own supply lines, you can get ammunition and food more quickly, you can get reinforcements more quickly, and the Americans can't. So that made sense. But the reason they stopped where they did, some people have said that Tecumseh, who is with Proctor, begins to turn on him at that point because Tecumseh clearly sees what's happening here. His homeland, the homeland of the Shawnee, is being completely left to the Americans, and he wants to see that remedied. And he's told the British, I mean, you have to stand and fight at some point. And so he's putting pressure on Proctor. But when they finally do meet up, Proctor actually picks a pretty good spot. So the field of battle, you've got a river on one side, which you always want to protect your flanks, especially when there are guys on horseback involved. So you've got the river on one side, and on the other side, you've got this massive swamp that it's hard to get through. It's heavily wooded, it's murky. So you've got that taken care of. And then in the middle of the field, you've got another little smaller depression with a kind of a swamp in it. So, Proctor has the ability to line his guys up and have their flanks protected. He's got a little bit of shelter in the middle. So that's where he chooses to make his stand. And it's at a place, the Canadians even refer to it as the Battle of Moravian Town, or we say the Battle of the Thames. Mm-hmm. And today it's in Chatham, Kent. And if you go up there now, it looks completely different. It's all farmland, and it's the irrigation. But that's where they line up at. They're prepared to meet for battle. And the British have decided they're gambling everything on this.
Mm-hmm. Say that place again. It is now
Chatham, Kent is kind of a little region, and they still have reenactments there. And for the 200th anniversary of the Battle of the Thames, there was actually a Kentucky contingent that went up and participated in that.
Cool.
So yeah,
and is that in Canada?
Mm-hmm. Yep, it's maybe an hour east of Detroit, so it's up in Ontario.
Okay, gotcha. And that's that's what I was trying to picture where exactly on the map that would be compared to other places. Because it's one of those battles that I hear about, and it's just early Kentucky history. It's just loaded. You find it all the time. In somebody's stories or some connection. You mentioned one of the other governors, Gabriel Slaughter. But that's just, you find those little mentions. That was a big ordeal during the time. I did
Yep.
want to throw up a nice little picture of Johnson.
Yeah.
Uh, Made that real quick. That's one I was thinking, man, I had a picture of him. I was like, oh, that's a good one to share. Because a lot of people, he's another Kentuckian that kind of had a lot of influence for his day that not a lot of people know about.
Yeah.
But so the British, and you bring up Tecumseh and the Shawnee, and we you have to mention like their whole influence on the War of 1812. Tecumseh had made this big kind of ordeal about it all. Rallied all the other tribes together. We did a podcast episode about him many moons ago.
Yeah.
His brother, the Prophet. Prophetstown is a Prophetstown, Ohio, that's named after him, or is that
That's
Indiana?
right.
Ohio.
Yeah, I think it's Indiana, but yeah.
Oh, it's Indiana. Yeah, it's Indiana. But yeah, and all that. And this was kind of, Tecumseh saw it as the decisive battle of like, if the Native Americans are going to stay strong, or I say battle, war, I should say. This was the war that was either going to push the settlers or the Kentuckians and all those people back, or not.
Right.
And another, well, I don't know much about Ohio's history, but Ohio was already a state. I don't know exactly how much of the land the Native Americans still owned or was living on in Ohio. I don't know much about that. They've been pushed out quite a bit, or southern half?
Yeah, it was mainly around the river that the settlements had happened. Cincinnati's still pretty small. What is Ohio statehood? Is 1803 or somewhere thereabouts. So
yeah,
the Treaty of Greenville, which happens in the 1790s, is kind of sets the line on where the boundary is supposed to be. So in theory, all of Ohio, almost all up to the very northern reaches, is supposed to be American territory. And of course, we see that violated in the War of 1812. So when you get more than a third of the way up the state, it's pretty sparse settlement, if at all.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, that's just one of those. I was not that clear on myself. But anyway, so Tecumseh, it was definitely saw this whole war as a pretty big final stand. As well. So are we ready to get the battle started? We've kind of warmed it up to this part, I think so.
Yeah. Well, the battle itself. Yeah. Well, the battle itself is actually pretty short, and the British have decided they're ready to go there. They're lined up. Of course, they've got cannon behind them, and they are ready to take on the Americans. This is the 41st Foot, or 41st, pretty much an infantry regiment. And the Kentuckians had really arrived on the scene on the 4th, and they know the British are not far away, so they make camp. They're waiting for the next morning. And Shelby's going from campfire to campfire, and he's encouraging his men, and he's, we're going to win this thing tomorrow, and he's slapping people on the back. And so again, here's this elderly governor who doesn't have to be there, and now that he is there, you're going to let this man out show your courage. Here are these young guys in their teens or their early 20s. And the accounts say that Shelby went around throughout the night. Finally, when it was time to go to bed, he found a tent that had an empty spot, and he crawled under a blanket with a fellow soldier. And the next morning, they get up. Yeah, he's a pretty tough fella.
That's crazy. It's so awesome. It's so awesome.
And when they line the infantry up the next morning, William Henry Harrison, you're on horseback, and you're trying to look at the spyglass and stuff, and you're preparing for the battle. Shelby is not. Shelby gets a musket, and Shelby gets in line with the infantry, because these are his troops. He's the governor of Kentucky. It is his job to be with them. And so if you can picture, again, we've mentioned this before, any governor, regardless of party, saying, I'm going with the National Guard. And not only am I going, I'm going as a private in the infantry, because they're my guys and my girls, and I'm going to make sure they make it home safe. And so it really is a great moment for Kentucky. And so they've realized a couple things about the battle. Yes, the British are lined up in front of them, but that large swamp on their flank That's where Tecumseh and his warriors are. And they realize, if they march forward, Tecumseh and his men are going to have the ability to get behind them. And he's got probably 1,000. It's hard to guess Indian numbers because they tend to vary over time. 1 month, have a group that may go home or other reinforcements that show up, but more than 1,000 men. And so if they get behind you, they turn your flank, the battle could go very badly for the Kentuckians. So it's determined that a force has to be split, that the infantry is going to have to go forward and hit the British lines, but we also have to fight the Indians in the swamp. So as they're making these preparations, someone makes an observation that the British have chosen a very peculiar formation. They're lined up in what's called open formation. So rather than being shoulder to shoulder with each other, the British are about, put your arms out, about that far apart from one another.
Okay.
And there's been a great debate on why they did this. Some people have argued that, well, they know that the Kentuckians had a reputation for being sharpshooters. Maybe it made them harder to hit. I don't really buy that. These guys are shooting muskets, and I don't care how good a shot you are. I mean, most of these people don't have rifles. There are some. You're not going to do much damage there. Maybe Proctor was trying to stretch his line a bit more. It's hard to know. But there are two lines of British soldiers, and they're spread out a bit. And
let me interrupt. Do you think maybe just to show look like there was a bigger force by chance? Would that have been?
I've wondered that. They didn't have a particularly large field to spread out on, so they didn't need that as much. But that makes as much sense as anything. And so some people have advanced that theory, and it makes sense, to me, that you're trying to look, like you've got a few more men than you do. But this causes an immediate strategy session to take place. And the Kentuckians and Richard Johnson and his men say, you know what? We can ride between those guys. I know we can make it. And yes, they're armed. There's two lines of them. They get cannon behind it. But if we can slide in the gaps, we can turn that flank. And they said, that seems pretty dangerous. It's pretty risky because they're armed. They've got their guns loaded. You guys are on horseback, so you're a bigger target. Would it not be better to have an infantry charge? So there's this debate going on. And finally, Harrison gives his consent. Fine. We can go forward with the plan to use the mounted infantry. So they divide the force, and Richard Johnson has under his command his brother, James. So you get James Johnson or Richard Johnson. James Johnson is going to take a group of the mounted infantry, and they're going to rush the British lines with the rest of the infantry that's on foot behind them. While this is taking place, Richard Johnson and a contingent are going to move towards the swamp where Tecumseh is, and they're going to try to meet both sides at the same time. The problem with this is it's a big swamp, and you need to know where the Indians are kind of centered, because if you end up attacking the wrong spot, you're off guard. They need to find a way to figure out where they are, and the only way they can think of is to draw native fire. And so they take 20 volunteers whose job it simply was to ride forward and let the Indians shoot at you. And then when they see the muzzle flashes, they would know where the enemy was. So they're called the Forlorn Hope because you're probably not coming out of this. And I wish they had invented the term. It's actually been in use prior to that.
So, yeah.
So, yeah.
Do you know those 20 men that, do you have a list of their names by chance that volunteered for that?
I don't. And I don't know. There may be one out there, but I haven't seen it. So I would love to know who they are, because you talk about brave. We do know that when they rush forward, 19 of the 20 are hit. They don't all die. So some of them die, but some of them don't. But 19 out of 20 guys are actually hit with a musket ball. So it was a dangerous assignment.
What'd you call it again? The Forlorn Hope?
Forlorn Hope.
Forlorn Hope.
You've given up hope. You're, all you who enter here. So. But as they rush forward,
bravery.
Oh yeah. And then the rest of Johnson's guys, sometimes you'll see them in pictures and things, and they're all mounted because that looks cool. And of course, they're supposed to be mounted infantry. But in reality, outside of those 20 guys, they're all on foot, because you're going into a swamp, and you've got to be able to go, wet footstep by wet footstep, slogging through this. So the battle launches, and the Kentuckians are running forward, and there's this thunder of hoofs. And you hear, remember the Raisin, and they're shouting at the top of their lungs. And there's actually a painting that we looked at a few weeks ago. And they're rushing forward there. And just as predicted, they thread the needle. And of course, the British fire, but
Mhm.
before they could do anything, the cavalry, or they're not cavalry, they're mounted infantry. The mounted infantry are behind them, and then those
Yeah.
waves of infantry are in front of them, and they're just sandwiched in between. So within a matter of minutes, the British contingent surrenders. I mean, you're completely surrounded. It took probably 10 minutes or so for Richard Johnson and his guys to kind of push the Indians sort of out of the swamp, but there's a rolling battle. So the Indians are falling back and they're firing and loading, behind trees and that sort of thing. So it probably about half an hour before fighting stops on that front. But within
Mhm.
30 minutes, this thing is over. And it was devastating for the British because Tecumseh's killed.
Yep.
And Richard Johnson, of course, is given credit for killing Tecumseh. Did he?
This
If you're
is
running,
another one.
yeah, that's right. If
Oh,
you,
William Whitley.
that's right, that's right. So but he gets the credit. Why? Well, he was running for vice president later, and it helps to have that.
Yeah.
It helps to be a war hero. But someone killed him, and of course, the Indians oftentimes would carry their dead away, so the losses weren't known. But just the loss of Tecumseh himself was such a severe blow because
Yeah.
he was probably one of the greatest leaders of the War of 1812 in
Yeah.
his terms, in his thinking of strategy on a large scale, in his ability to muster charisma from the men, in his negotiations and his tactics. And, even in the way he treated prisoners, Tecumseh had a set of standards, and he often
Mhm.
chided the British on allowing, massacres and things to happen. So he truly was one of the greatest native leaders, probably in American history, but certainly the greatest in this conflict. But as the dust settles, the British have lost 570 some, almost 600 men that have been captured,
Wow.
and
Yeah.
this is the 41st Foot. The Native Americans have lost 15 or 20 or so. Again, it's hard to know exactly because they carry the dead off the field. But the Americans have 26 killed. They've got a similar number wounded. And,
Mhm.
with that, the battle is over. The one person they do not find, this is my favorite part of the story, I suppose. And as a historian, you should always be unbiased, but I'm sorry, I'm not in this point. Uh,
Uh,
there's something they don't find and something they do find that I think just makes the story complete. And the one thing they don't find is at this point, General Proctor. He'd been watching from a distance and
mhm.
kind of knew his reputation, I think, with the Kentuckians, that he was blamed for what had happened at the River Raisin, and realized that the Americans were very generous as far as taking prisoners and treating them well. But he would have been the exception. If he'd been
Mhm.
captured,
Yeah.
he'd been
Yeah.
executed immediately.
Yeah.
So before the battle is over, Proctor flees the field, which is something
Mhm.
a commander should never do. And he's later
Yeah.
relieved of command and he's court-martialed for that action. So that's who they don't find. They do find, however, his papers. They find his sword, his ceremonial sword,
Oh,
and they
yeah.
find a very special brass cannon. And I don't remember if we
Mhm.
talked about this in one of the first few
I
episodes,
don't think so.
but
No.
at at Detroit, before it fell, there was a special cannon that was brass. It was kind of gold colored, and it had an inscription on it because it was captured during the American Revolution at the Battle of Saratoga. So just to rewind a little bit, Saratoga was fought in 1777. It was a major
Mhm.
turning point. It helped bring the French into the war. It was just a great victory. And the Americans had captured this cannon from the British. They had seized the momentum. And so here it
Yeah.
is defending the frontier in Detroit. And when Detroit is surrendered, the British retake the cannon. And there's that
Ah,
inscription on it, and they're laughing at it and stuff. And it was really symbolic of independence. It was
yeah.
symbolic of America's future. It was bright and shiny, and we had taken it from the enemy. And for 30 years, or more than 30 years, it had been that symbol facing westward. And then it was in enemy hands for a year. And now, with this battle, that has been recaptured. And
There
that
you
was
go.
not lost on the Kentuckians. And if you want to see it, it's in Frankfurt at the Military History Museum. So it's still on display.
Whoa!
We still have it in Kentucky, and the inscription's there. So, uh,
Wow, that's pretty cool. I know exactly where that is.
yeah,
Well, I'm about to make stop there because that's really, you know, completes the circle, I guess, if
it
you wanna
does.
say, you know?
Pretty awesome
Um,
memento to have.
yeah, a little more. Well, I do have this one picture I wanted to show up. I forgot to, this is the Battle of Lake Erie. I forgot to show that one. But just some cool pictures, or paintings, I should say. Um, you talked about Tecumseh too, and about how important he was. Uh, he too. I don't know if you know or not, but have you ever read the Frontiersmen? And this is which
Alan Eckert.
I've heard. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Simon Kenton was another Kentuckian who marched up in. He was old. He marched up and fought in the Battle of the Thames. Um, but a few things. So Tecumseh, before battle, told his men that he was going to die in the Battle of the Thames, and then and he told them to stay strong whenever he died and so forth. I'm pretty sure though once he was killed, um, their ranks kind of folded. Um, but the other thing was that Simon they looked for Tecumseh's body because they wanted to uh, I guess if you want to say mutilated or do whatever they want, and they found Simon Kenton to identify the body, and he did not identify the right body on purpose. Like he
Yeah. Yeah.
intentionally was like he admired Tecumseh too as a you know I guess warrior,
Right.
chief leader, and just another thing. I don't know about you, man, but Simon Kenton is definitely my number one frontiersman of Kentucky. So, um, not,
It's hard to beat
not
him. I'm a James Harrod guy myself. Like I
I
love the Harrod
understand. I
story.
understand.
But yeah, it's hard to argue with Kenton.
Yeah,
You got
yeah,
an all-star team going. So
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's and everybody likes Boone, of course, but
oh yeah,
thing is, Simon Kenton saved Boone, Fort Logan. I mean, he did a lot. But that's another episode to talk about. Actually, we actually already talked about Simon Kenton a few times, but maybe we need to do a rehash on him. But
well, you
that's
mentioned
my
William
bias.
Whitley also.
Yep. I mean,
It's another hero
uh,
that's there.
yeah. So that's it's so compelling, all the different angles and the connections. Like, just that's one thing I guess I've enjoyed and began to learn and love more about history is connecting all those little dots. All these people like
Right.
William Whitley,
Yeah.
um, Benjamin Logan. He I could have very well seen him going. He died in 1801, I believe. But yeah, so many people. Simon Kenton went up there. You got Minton Johnson or Richard Johnson.
Richard Johnson. Yeah.
Uh, all those connecting. It connects so much, and then you even get it on the British side. The whole. I mean, that Cannon story is just so wild.
Oh yeah.
Um, um, Pretty awesome. Pretty cool. Anything else about I guess the Battle of the Thames that
You
you
know,
want
it,
to
it
mention?
it it ends the way it should in the sense that they march home. Of course, they've got a number of prisoners with them, and a lot of people don't know this, but the state penitentiary, which was at the time in downtown Frankfurt, and was there until the flood of '37, um, the British were kept there, and there are no ships to take them home this time. So basically, they're racing the weather. They're trying to get home, and they march around the lake. They stop at Frenchtown long enough to bury all the bones they could find, and they make it back in early November. They were dismissed from service. They've made it home, and it kind of sets up a period of healing to some
Yeah,
degree for the state. But of course, and really, it ends the war in the Northwest. We
yeah,
know there's still some stuff raging in the South. Davy Crockett and his Tennesseans, are fighting what they call the Red Stick War, but they're fighting a number of tribes down there. And of course, the Battle of New Orleans comes a little bit
yeah,
later. But as
yeah,
far as Canada, there are skirmishes here and there, but the war is over, and Kentucky has won it for that region, and they are holding a part of Ontario that gets given back at the end of the war. But we continue to hold that until the war's end. So,
yeah.
yeah,
And when you say we, do you mean Kentuckians or just as in America or U.S.
the United
troops?
States held it, and I know
Mhm.
Kentucky militiamen will continue to be stationed there because we've
Yeah,
got some letters that were written from the men. I don't know that they held it exclusively. I would say that that route from Detroit to that region is probably beefed up over time, But yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to give bonus points to Kentucky,
Oh, I'm with you. I'm with you.
So yeah, well, that's pretty good. And the next episode we have, we'll talk about New Orleans because I mean, this is kind of a little bit of time. Um, you know, it's a turning point in the West for sure. Probably I mean, honestly, if you want to say the final stand in the West, as far as this campaign. But a lot of stuff goes on in the East here to come. I guess you would say that. I mean, is it accurate to say that the British pretty much give up on the, Ohio front, Lake Erie? That's pretty much done for.
Yeah, for the time being, anyways, they realize they've got to shore up the East. And of course, we know in the next year, you mentioned earlier, the Capitol is burned. And of course, we burned the British Parliament in York first. And so this was in retaliation for that. But, the War with Napoleon, yeah, the War with Napoleon's over. And so now they don't have all these distractions in Europe. And they know it, and we know it. And we begin to see a number of confrontations, in the East, culminating in the burning of Washington and the Battle of Siege of Baltimore. But the only thing that's we have in Kentucky that I find particularly interesting during this time is the Capitol burns. And when there are people who reported seeing lights on in the Capitol late at night, which really shouldn't have been, candles burning or something.
Yeah.
And then the Capitol burns, and when they see it on fire, they go to put it out. The doors are locked, like they can't get in. So I've never found a connection to the war. I would love to write a whodunit and find some way of proving the British plot. Probably not, obviously.
But something's a ray or something's a right. So well, that's pretty good, David. Thanks again for coming on. Again, if you want to read some more, I know the book has more journal entries, more details than we're going over here. So the War of 1812 in the West, strictly or specifically more talking about Kentucky's involvement and so forth. Next time we'll kind of bridge the gap from the Thames all the way over to New Orleans, which is a good little bit of time, as the war goes.
Right.
Anything else?
I think that's hit it. It's worth remembering the sacrifice those folks made. It's a shame that we don't remember it more in schools and in our education and things. And so I appreciate you highlighting it here because it's such a big deal for Kentuckians. And it really was the time when Kentucky helped save the Union.
Yeah. Well, again, we appreciate you coming on, and we'll do it again soon. And for everybody out there, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. Welcome to the Kentucky History Channel, where we strive to bring you all the Kentucky history content you want and you deserve. Kentucky is a part of all of us, and we plan on covering all the history we can, from Pike County to Fulton County, from Louisville to Harlan. Here on our YouTube channel, you can find many videos dedicated to different events, people, governors, and places in Kentucky. There's something for everybody. While you're here, if you like the channel, hit the subscribe button and the notification button so you get notified anytime new Kentucky history is available. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon page as well, or patreon.com/KYHistoryPod. You've probably heard about Daniel Boone, but what about the rest of the frontiersmen who came to Kentucky and settled? That's what we want to bring to the Kentucky History Channel. The stories of the untold, the stories of those forgotten. One thing to expect on our channel is great Kentucky content. Some stories that you've never heard of. The Night Riders, who began in western Kentucky. Bloody Monday, the riots in Louisville. The assassination of Governor Goebel, the only governor ever assassinated in the United States. Stories from all over Kentucky, stories that are unforgettable once you've heard them. You can find out who counties in Kentucky are named after and how your county got started. From beginning to end, we plan to document every county in Kentucky, all 120. Reach out to us on all of our social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And also leave a comment on one of our YouTube videos. You can also check out our podcast episodes. You can subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. We're always seeking to find more Kentucky history so we can bring it to you, the viewers, the listeners. We want all the stories and all the events from Kentucky's great history to be told and shared everywhere.